Picture this like an American nightmare that turns into an American flex. A dictator who thought the world was a scoreboard. An army that bragged it could end history in 12 weeks. And a city that was supposed to be a quick stop on the way to oil and glory. Now freeze that scene at -40. Take away fuel. Take away bread. Take away bullets. Turn the sky into a closed door. Then listen closely. Because what you're about to hear is the sound of certainty dying. And before we even step into Stalingrad, understand something that Americans instinctively respect. This was one of the moments the free world's industrial muscle and refusal to bow started to prove that tyranny could be beaten. Not with speeches, not with wishful thinking, with steel, logistics, production, and relentless pressure, an approach that, across the wider war, the United States embodied like no other nation. The Nazi war machine was built on speed and intimidation, but had one weakness that every American factory worker, every shipyard crew, every convoy sailor would recognize instantly. If you can't supply it, you can break it. Stalingrad wasn't just a battle. It was a public execution of arrogance, and the world watched the invincible bleed out in slow motion. Because here's the part that should make you sit up straight if you're watching this in the U.S. The Axis didn't just lose men at Stalingrad. They lost the myth that they couldn't be stopped. They lost the swagger. They lost the psychological advantage that had been crushing capitals, collapsing governments, and making entire populations whisper, maybe resistance is pointless. Stalingrad helped kill that whisper. It was the kind of turning point that makes people dare to breathe again, dare to believe again, dare to fight again. And while the Soviet Union did the dying and the taking of ground here, make no mistake, the sacrifice was staggering. The broader Allied reality was tightening around Germany like a vice. America was learning fast, ramping up hard, becoming the arsenal of democracy in real time, and helping turn the war into something Germany could not win. A war of attrition against nations that could outproduce, outlast, and outthink them. The Nazis were built for the knockout punch. Stalingrad forced them into a marathon, and they didn't have the lungs. Now let's rewind to the summer of 1942, where it still felt, to German commanders and Nazi propagandists, like the world was bending their way. The Sixth Army under Friedrich Paulus moves east across scorched steppe and dust, chasing a plan that looks neat on maps and murderous in practice. The objective in that phase wasn't even romance or symbolism. It was operational logic. Secure the northern flank along the Don and Volga. Take the city. Push southeast. Anchor the lines so other forces could reach the Caucasus and the oil fields that Germany craved like oxygen. This was Fall Blau, the German summer offensive, and it was supposed to be the return of momentum after the winter shock outside Moscow. The Germans had tasted the reality of Russia's weather and distances, but they hadn't accepted it. Not fully. They still believed that one more push, one more clean breakthrough, one more collapse of Soviet formations, and the whole Eastern Front would fold. And on the surface, it looked plausible. Soviet units in the south had been battered and disorganized earlier in the offensive. Reserve armies were activated and thrown into the Stalingrad area with barely enough time to dig in. Some arrived with missing equipment, understrength formations, and gaps that would have been fatal in a cleaner war. But Stalingrad was not going to be a clean war. It was going to be a war where the normal math stopped working. You could count men and tanks and guns, but you couldn't easily measure what happens when an army is forced to fight at the end of a supply line that stretches across a continent, against an opponent who is learning, adapting, and willing to spend blood to buy time. And time was the most valuable currency on that front, because time is what allows reinforcements to arrive, factories to relocate, and plans to mature into traps. The German advantage early on wasn't just hardware. It was competence, combined arms coordination, tight command culture, the ability to isolate enemy armor from infantry and anti-tank weapons, and destroy pieces of the enemy force in sequence. They were experts at taking messy, panicked Soviet formations and turning them into pockets. And they tried to do exactly that as they approached the Don Bend, break through, get to the river quickly, encircle Soviet forces west of the Don, destroy them, and then roll into Stalingrad like a final flourish. The logic was classic German operational art. The problem was that classic German operational art required one thing more than anything else: movement. And movement requires fuel. It requires parts. It requires trucks and rail and reliable flow. And by the summer of 1942, the German war machine was already showing a sickness that would only get worse. Logistics was straining under the weight of ambition. This is where the story begins to tilt from invincible predator to rival starting to panic. The Germans were far from home, and their logistics were being crushed by distance, limited resources, and the sheer scale of the front. Units were being transferred, plans were being expanded, priorities were being shuffled, and the supply system didn't magically grow stronger because Hitler demanded more. It grew weaker. Fuel shortages weren't an occasional inconvenience. They were becoming a defining feature. Divisions left elements behind so the rest could keep moving. Vehicles that should have been part of a coherent spearhead became stranded metal, waiting for gasoline that didn't arrive. And as ridiculous as it sounds, the German advance, the famous mechanized lightning, sometimes depended on siphoning fuel from one vehicle to keep another alive. That is not what unstoppable looks like. That is what an empire looks like when it starts chewing its own tail. And then Hitler made the kind of decision that turns a hard campaign into a fatal one. He started to gamble with strategic focus. The German plan sprawled. Objectives multiplied. Forces were split across too many axes at once. The drive south toward the Caucasus and the drive east toward the Volga were treated like parallel necessities, and Stalingrad began to transform from a useful point on a map into a symbolic obsession. Symbols are dangerous because symbols don't care about supply. Symbols don't care about casualties. Symbols don't care about snow. Symbols only care about ego. And when Stalingrad became personal, when it became the city with Stalin's name must fall, the German command system began to drift away from reality and toward compulsion. The city itself was not a neat target. Stalingrad stretched along the Volga, industrial and brutal, a place of factories, workers' districts, and the kind of terrain that turns tanks into liabilities. The Luftwaffe's bombing shattered neighborhoods into a lunar landscape, and in a normal war you might think that would finish the defender. But ruins are a defender's weapon. Ruins create cover, angles, choke points, ambush positions, and confusion. Ruins break lines of sight. Ruins force infantry to fight up close. Ruins swallow momentum. And as the German army pressed into the city, it discovered something that would haunt it for the rest of the war. Modern warfare does not guarantee quick victory when the battlefield becomes a maze of broken concrete and human stubbornness. The German doctrine of synchronized movement, tanks, infantry, air support, was now forced into a nightmare of short distances and constant contact. Planes couldn't bomb freely because friend and enemy were sometimes meters apart. Tanks couldn't maneuver because streets were clogged with debris. Every building became a small war, every floor a separate front line, and the city turned into a grinder that ate time by the hour. Meanwhile, as Germans poured divisions into this urban meat grinder, the Soviets were doing something that the German High Command repeatedly underestimated, preparing to strike where Germany was weakest, not at the point of maximum German strength inside the city, but on the flanks held by Allied Axis forces, Romanians, Italians, Hungarians, often under-equipped, stretched thin, and treated by German leadership with open contempt. That contempt matters, because it shaped the German gamble. They believed the flanks would hold. They believed the Red Army was too broken to coordinate a major operational maneuver. They believed their enemies were incapable of pulling off something complex. That belief wasn't just wrong. It was humiliatingly wrong. And when it collapsed in a way that made the Germans look not just defeated, but fooled. On the morning of November 19th, 1942, the world around Stalingrad detonated, not with a single heroic charge, but with artillery, massive, disciplined, planned, and concentrated. The Soviet offensive that followed, Operation Uranus, was designed with cold logic. It didn't care about the romance of fighting for every block inside the city. It cared about encirclement, break the weaker flanks, drive fast, avoid getting stuck in local firefights, go around resistance, close the ring. And within days, the Soviet pincers met. The Sixth Army, deep in a city it had been ordered to take at all costs, suddenly discovered that it was the one surrounded. The hunter became the prey. And if you want the rival's crying essence in its purest form, it starts here. Because the moment you encircle a proud force that built its identity on initiative, on movement, on domination, you are not just threatening its body. You are attacking its ego. You are forcing it to admit that it no longer controls the situation. Paulus immediately understood what encirclement meant. Any competent commander would. He requested permission to break out, to retreat, to restore a line, to preserve combat power. What came back from Hitler was not a plan. It was an order. Hold. Stay. The airlift will supply you. Relief will come. It was the kind of promise that sounds powerful from far away and becomes murder up close. And this is where the Sixth Army's slow humiliation begins to look like a psychological horror story. Because the German soldier in the pocket didn't just have to fight the enemy. He had to fight the calendar. He had to fight hunger. He had to fight the creeping realization that the leaders who sent him there were lying to him, and that the Reich's confidence was now a prison wall. The airlift is the kind of thing that, on paper, can sound heroic. Planes flying through enemy skies, delivering supplies to trapped men, keeping hope alive. In reality, it was a mathematical impossibility wearing a uniform. An army that size needed an enormous tonnage of food, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies, every single day, just to function, and even more to fight. The Luftwaffe, already strained, battered, and operating in brutal winter conditions, could not deliver what was required. Some days it delivered a fraction. Some days it delivered almost nothing. As the Soviets tightened the ring, airfields fell or came under fire, forcing transport routes to become longer, more dangerous, more punishing. Planes were shot down. Runways became chaos. Wounded piled up. Men fought for space on evacuation flights. And when an army begins to fight its own people in an airfield, when order collapses into desperate shoving and pleading, you're watching a rival stop pretending. Then winter arrived like a second enemy army, except this one could not be shot, bargained with, or outmaneuvered. The cold was not a background detail. It was an active force that attacked bodies and equipment with equal cruelty. Engines seized. Weapons failed. Fingers and toes died. Men learned that even breathing could feel like swallowing broken glass. And inside the pocket, the Germans faced a reality they were psychologically unprepared for. They were not the ones deciding when suffering would end. They were trapped on the enemy's timetable. Every day the relief did not arrive. The Sixth Army became weaker, thinner, less capable. And the Soviets understood this perfectly. They didn't need to rush. They needed to keep pressure, keep tightening, keep denying airfields, keep breaking the enemy's ability to move, and let time do what time always does to trapped men. It breaks them. By January 1943, the situation had moved from dangerous to terminal. The Soviets reorganized command around the pocket. The ring of armies became more coordinated. The German situation became more desperate. The most revealing detail isn't a single dramatic battle. It's the small signals of decay. A lack of ammunition so severe that Germans couldn't even respond to harassment with artillery. The bizarre improvisations, flares into the sky to mimic fireworks because bullets were too precious. Divisions shrinking. Headquarters staffs flying out. Regiments turned into battalions. Battalions turned into fragments. The front line increasingly manned by men who were never meant to be frontline infantry, because the army was cannibalizing its rear just to keep thin crust of resistance alive. An army that had once prided itself on professionalism was now burning its own structure for warmth. And then came the Soviet hammer, Operation Ring. On January 10th, a concentrated artillery barrage began, one of the most intense of the war so far, followed by coordinated assaults designed to crack the pocket from west to east. This wasn't about a dramatic charge into the city center. This was systematic. It was industrial. It was the kind of methodical destruction that America, across the wider Allied effort, would recognize instantly. Concentrate overwhelming firepower, break the enemy's ability to respond, exploit the breach, repeat. The Germans could fight fiercely, and they did. They inflicted losses. They delayed. They clung to hills and villages and frozen lines with the stubbornness of men who know there is no mercy in physics. But they were bleeding out in a closed room. Every kilometer lost shrank the pocket. Every pocket contraction meant less space, fewer airfields, fewer supplies, more pressure, more panic. As the Soviets pushed, the German command system began to lose visibility. Reports grew unreliable or stopped. Units couldn't even describe where they were. The pocket became not just a physical trap, but an information collapse. And nothing reveals fear like confusion. Because confusion is the moment when even discipline can't hide the fact that control is gone. At the same time, the German higher command far away continued issuing demands that sounded like they were written in an alternate universe. Orders to retake positions that were already lost. Questions about why villages had been evacuated, as if paperwork mattered more than survival. This disconnect is one of the most humiliating elements of Stalingrad. The empire was so addicted to its own propaganda that it tried to command reality by memo. Inside the pocket, the psychological breaking point approached. Men were starving and freezing. Fuel was almost non-existent, which meant tanks that still existed often couldn't move. Anti-tank guns were abandoned because there was no way to haul them, no fuel to transport them, and no time to organize. Medical facilities became scenes of despair. Wounded men piled up, waiting for flights that might never come. The strong began to look like skeletons. And as the Soviet pressure intensified, rumors spread like disease, that tanks were approaching airfields, that escape was still possible, that some miracle relief was imminent. You can hear a trapped army's mind starting to shatter in those rumors. Because rumors are what fill the space when truth is too horrible to accept. At this stage, Hitler's leadership turned crueler, not smarter. Promotions and rhetoric became weapons. When Paulus was promoted to Field Marshal late in the collapse, it wasn't an honor. It was psychological coercion. The unspoken tradition was that a field marshal did not surrender. The message was obvious: die or become shame. But Stalingrad is where the myth of honor collided with the reality of human limits. A man in a frozen basement, surrounded, starving, watching his army disintegrate, doesn't live in a world of banners and speeches. He lives in a world of ration scraps and frostbite, and men who can't stand up anymore. And at the end, tradition didn't matter. The promise didn't matter. The speeches didn't matter. The pocket collapsed, the Sixth Army ceased to exist as a fighting force, and the surrender came, not as a dramatic cinematic moment, but as the final administrative act of a disaster that had already happened. When the surrender was completed, tens of thousands of surviving German soldiers marched into captivity. Many would not return, and the world absorbed the meaning. Stalingrad was the first time Nazi Germany suffered a catastrophe so huge it couldn't be spun as a temporary setback. It wasn't a tactical retreat. It wasn't an orderly withdrawal. It was a public destruction. It was the breaking of an elite formation that Hitler had treated like a personal instrument. And if you want the rival's crying essence framed in a way that lands with an American audience, it's this. Stalingrad was the moment the Axis realized the war was no longer a story they controlled. The bully realized the room wasn't afraid anymore. Back in Germany, the mood shifted in ways that mattered. The propaganda machine could still scream, but it couldn't erase the empty chairs, the missing sons, the gnawing fear that the Reich's promises were hollow. When a regime that built itself on victory has to explain loss, it starts to rot. And for the Allies, Stalingrad's deeper impact was psychological and strategic. It forced Germany into defensive thinking. It altered the balance of initiative on the Eastern Front. It pushed Germany further into a war of attrition it could not sustain. And it helped synchronize, in the broadest sense, the worldwide pressure that America, Britain, and the Soviet Union were applying from different directions. The German state had bet everything on speed and shock. The Allies turned the conflict into a test of endurance, production, and coordination, areas where the United States, especially, would become a decisive force as the war matured. So the lesson of Stalingrad is not just winter is harsh or urban combat is brutal. The lesson is that arrogance creates blindness, and blindness creates disasters. Germany believed the Soviets couldn't coordinate large operations. Stalingrad answered with a pincer that trapped an army. Germany believed promises could substitute for logistics. Stalingrad answered with starvation and frozen runways. Germany believed it could choose its battles and dictate tempo. Stalingrad answered by forcing them to fight on the enemy's schedule, at the end of a rope that kept tightening. This is what it looks like when a rival doesn't just lose a match, but loses the confidence that made them dangerous in the first place. And if you want to end this with a line that hits the core of your channel's logic, without cheap gore, without cartoon villainy, just cold historical power, then understand this. Stalingrad wasn't the day Germany almost won, and then got unlucky. It was the day the Nazi war machine met a kind of resistance, and a kind of reality it could not intimidate, outmaneuver, or outlast. It was the day the myth of invincibility froze to death, and after that, the war didn't immediately end, but it changed direction. The Axis stopped looking like the future and started looking like something that could be beaten, dismantled, and buried. Because once the world sees the bully bleed, the spell breaks. Once the world watches the unstoppable beg the sky for supplies that never arrive, something permanent changes. Stalingrad was that moment. The moment Hitler's war broke. The moment the rivals stopped smiling. The moment the invincible learned what Americans have always respected about war at its most unforgiving level. Logistics wins. Industry wins. Endurance wins. And when a free people decide they will not bow, even the loudest empire eventually finds itself trapped in the cold, staring at a closed horizon, realizing too late that the world has moved on without it.